We gather this weekend to learn, to gain insight, and to plot our journey forward. We look to our keynote speaker to help us envision that journey. To introduce our speaker, we welcome Marianne Duddy-Burke back to the virtual podium.
Thank you, Chris. One of the hardest parts of being a prophet is that you often have to proclaim unwelcome truths to the very community you love and are a part of. As a prophet, you help raise up the groaning of people to leaders failing to care for them. And the prophet generally knows that this message will not be happily received. I'm sure that our keynote speaker, Father Brian Massengale, has found himself in that position quite frequently throughout his ministry, and especially in the past couple of years. To be an openly gay Black priest in the Roman Catholic Church in the US cannot be easy. To repeatedly be the lone voice daring to speak from that perspective is unimaginably challenging. And yet, speak, challenge, confront, unmask, and openly name ugly truths of both our past and our present, Brian does over and over and over and over again. Brian's academic and intellectual credentials are extensive and impressive. He currently is the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University and the Senior Fellow in Fordham's Center for Ethics Education. A leader in Catholic theology, he is president-elect of the Society of Christian Ethics and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He's also a former convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. Brian is the award-winning author of 2 books and over 150 articles, book chapters, and book reviews. He wrote the groundbreaking document for Catholic Charities USA entitled Poverty and Racism: Overlapping Threats to the Common Good. Brian has served as a consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, providing theological assistance on issues such as criminal justice, capital punishment, environmental justice, and affirmative action. He has also been a theological consultant for the National Black Catholic Congress, the Catholic Health Association, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and so many more. He's an active participant in the network of Catholic thought leaders advocating for the full inclusion of LGBTQ+ persons in both society and the faith community. Dr. Massengale is the recipient of numerous honors and recognitions for his academic scholarship and his advocacy of justice. Among these are 4 honorary doctorates, the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests Pope John XXIII Award for his tireless efforts to create a world where the dignity of each person is respected and protected, Catholic Charity USA's Centennial Gold Medal for leadership and service in the social mission of the Catholic Church, and the Reverend Al McKnight Award from the National Joint Conference of Black Catholic Clergy, Sisters, Deacons, and Seminarians for outstanding witness on behalf of justice for the marginalized. Brian is also a dear friend and someone I have long trusted in having deep and honest conversations about soul-level matters and the critical issues of doing justice work well. Given all of this, it is clear why we were so thrilled and grateful when he agreed to address Dignity USA at this very critical moment in our history and this moment in time. I am very honored to introduce Brian Massengale, one of our prophets, and his address, God heard their groaning. Can dignity hear and answer the cries of the whole LGBTQ community? Brian, welcome to the stage.
Wow, thank you so much. Marianne, that was beautiful. And you can tell I'm kind of choked up a little bit, but yeah, that was just, it's wonderful when a friend speaks such generous words, and you are a friend. To the dignity community out there, it is so good to be with you, albeit virtually and over computer screens. And yes, we're all kind of tired of it, but this is our new normal, so we'll make the best of it. It is good to be with you. We need to be together. We need to come together, especially in these unsettled times as we continue to grapple with the myriad challenges that face us individually, nationally, and as a community of sexually marginalized and sexually gifted people. Note gifted. Let's not lose sight of that. We have lots of challenges, but we also have gifts. It's good to be with Marianne and Chris Pett again. They've been allies and indeed friends in this struggle for full justice and radical inclusion in both our church and society. And I want to thank especially my new friend, Logan Bear, who has been just this marvel, this tech guru behind the scenes that's made all this possible. So if this goes off seamlessly, we all owe him a drink or prayers and maybe all the above. It's good to be with you as you discern your journey forward, a journey forward into being a leading organization in the struggle for full justice and radical inclusion. Let's see, why won't this advance? Logan, I'm having some problems advancing the slide, so can you help with what's going on? Ah, there we go. Okay, let's see if that helps any. Oh. Okay, Logan, so you're seeing why Logan is, click on the arrows on the PowerPoint. Oh, okay, let's see if that works. Okay, great. Got it. Thank you, Logan. Great. See, I told you, we owe him a lot. We gather on the 20th anniversary of the multiple terror attacks in our country, when thousands of lives were lost and countless more were devastated in the New York City metropolitan area, at the Pentagon, and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Here in New York, where I am, and across the country, memorials will call the names of those who have perished. But we also need to be mindful of another set of victims who were decisively impacted by the attacks, namely those of Muslim faith and Middle Eastern descent, who were and who still are targets of anger, suspicion, and fear. One of my vivid memories post 9/11 was flying on one of the first flights after the airports were reopened. I went to a conference, and at the airport, we had to go through what was then unprecedented security. Now it's been kind of routine. The airports were eerily empty. As I got to my destination and waited at the taxi stand to go to the hotel, the person in front of me became loudly agitated. He refused to get into the waiting cab because the driver was wearing a turban. He was a Sikh, not a Muslim, but his strangeness and dark skin were enough to thoroughly unsettle this customer. "I'm not getting in with him," he said. "He might try to kill me." I moved ahead of him, taking the cab that he refused. And just before I drove away in my anger, I asked, "What makes you think you're so important that he would want to kill you and risk his life?" Today, as we gather, we remember that Jews, Muslims, Christians, rich, poor, gay people, people like Father Michael Judge and Mark Bingham, Immigrant workers and Wall Street executives, flight attendants and soldiers, all were killed that day. We remember all those who lost their lives that day and their loved ones. All who comprise a human collage of many colors, ethnicities, sexualities, languages, and religions. We also pray for those who have borne the brunt of our nation's irrational fears and scapegoating. Let us pray for our nation as it struggles to count the cost paid for our fears and the trillions of dollars spent and the many lives lost fighting wars inspired by our deep, unfaced anxieties. And let us continue to pray, as we have already, for a full measure of justice and radical inclusion, for these are the hallmarks of the reign of God. Full justice, radical inclusion. I've used that phrase several times already in this short introduction. It is my deepest hope and challenge for Dignity USA as you consider your journey forward. This hope for full justice and radical inclusion. According to your statement of mission and purpose, Dignity exists, and you see it on the screen, exists to witness that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex Catholics in our diversity are members of the Christ's mystical body, numbered among the people of God. In our diversity. What does that mean? I want to meditate on that phrase and the call that it contains for full justice and radical inclusion by asking the question, can Dignity USA hear and answer the cries that come from the whole community? How will Dignity hear the cries of our sexually diverse community, impacted as we are by the realities of racial injustice, gender exclusion, and social marginalization, all that stem from our nation's and our church's complicity in white nationalism? And I want to break open the fact that white nationalism is a complex threat to all of us. And therefore, our response in justice must be complex and multiple and fully respecting of the diversity of our community. Now, to do that and let you know that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, this is your favorite slide here, the overview for the Zoom weary. I want to begin by breaking open intersectionality and how it plays a role in the coming out process. And don't worry, it won't be too academic because I'm going to make this very personal. Then I'm going to examine the challenge of white nationalism and what white nationalism has to do with LGBTQ plus persons. I will argue that it is the growing edge and the litmus test for a commitment to full justice and radical inclusion. I will end with the challenge that this presents to Dignity as it contemplates moving forward. And I'll end by offering a blessing for Dignity's commitment to be a witness of radical inclusion for our whole community in all of its glorious and beautiful and, dare I say, fabulous diversity. So with that, then, it's the beginning, the middle, the end. And if we depart from the outline, it just means we're going to have a Pentecostal moment. We'll let the Holy Spirit do its thing, but then we'll become Catholic again and get back to the outline and follow everything that's written in the books with the red letters. We Catholics are good at that. So I come to this conversation, as Marianne says, as a Black gay priest and theologian. I am informed not only by my sexuality, my faith, and my study of the church's ethical traditions. I'm also informed by the traditions of the Black freedom struggles in the United States. In my own person, in my own life, I embody the complexity, or better said, the multiplicity and the diversity of LGBTQ identities. Intersectionality is a word often heard today, and happily it is being used to frame our understanding of LGBTQ reality and how we describe our community. For example, you see on the screen that GLAAD, one of the foremost LGBTQ human rights groups, declares that there can be no pride if it is not intersectional. This is an awareness that's come more and more to the forefront of our community after last summer's murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, among too many others. Now, while I could offer an academic definition of intersectionality, intersectionality is simply another way of saying we need to look at, appreciate, understand, and celebrate the whole person. While our community is united by sharing sexualities and gender expressions that differ from the majority, our sexualities and our sexual experiences are also shaped and influenced by other factors that make up who we are. Race, nationality and national origin, immigration status, disability, gender expression, age, and the like. Now, all of these are important. Yet for today, I'm going to focus on how race and ethnicity influence and shape the experiences of LGBTQ persons of color and the impact this has for Catholic LGBTQ justice advocacy. Now, I want to make this personal and explain this by talking about my coming out story. One of the bonding experiences in our community is sharing our coming out stories, our experiences of realizing, accepting, and then sharing our sexual awareness. This is one of mine, a story of coming out as a Black gay man of faith. I made my first Ignatian retreat, a silent directed retreat, as a seminarian in 1982. Yes, that means I'm old, but thank God, Black don't crack. I can say that. One of the passages I was given to pray over was the first creation story in the book of Genesis, where God creates the cosmos in 6 days. In my meditation, I pictured myself as an observer, watching the beauty of creation as it unfolded according to God's word. I saw the stars come to be, the dry lands appear, the earth's animals and creatures filling the land and the sea, and finally, human beings emerging as the fulfillment of creation. In my imagination, my prayerful imagination, my prayer, I looked at creation and saw friends and people that I knew. It was wonderful. Except as I looked at creation and at the world's people in my prayerful imagination, I noticed that when creation was finished, there wasn't a single Black person, nor were there any gay people. As I looked at humanity, at all those created in the image of God, there was no one that looked like me or loved like me. There was nothing in creation that mirrored me. This profoundly, deeply, painfully shook me. My spirit ached. because it meant that despite 8 years of Catholic grade school education, 4 years of Catholic high school, 4 years of Catholic university as a theology and philosophy major, and 3 years of graduate seminary training in theology, and being an honor student too, very proud of that, that despite what I've been taught about how all human beings were created in God's image and likeness, at some deep place within me, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. My own prayer betrayed that I didn't believe it. I didn't believe that God could be imaged as Black or as gay, and certainly not as both simultaneously. When I reported my prayer experience to my retreat director, she wisely said, "Well, I think you have some work to do." So she gave me other passages to meditate on, passages that spoke of God's love. She invited me to pray with these, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I didn't want to hear about God's love because I was angry. I was furious at God for making me Black and gay. I remember waking up one night, beating my pillow in rage and in sorrow, saying over and over, "Why did you do this to me? I didn't ask for it. What kind of God are you? Why would you do this? Why would you make me like this to endure all of this pain and hurt and rejection?" I screamed and yelled, shaking and sobbing with angry, bitter, sad, burning tears. It was only after I cried and moaned and screamed and yelled and exhausted all of my hurt and anger, my fear and pain, my outrage. It was only then that God could break through the cracks of my soul. Then I could hear God when I read these words from the prophet Isaiah: "You are precious in my sight, and I love you." I wept again, crying tears of joy, a joy that was inexpressible. And then I could pray the second creation story from the second chapter of Genesis, the one where the earth creature is formed out of the ground. And I saw myself as that original human being and felt God blowing life, God's life into me. And I was at last, truly a part of God's creation. That's one of my coming out stories. Coming out as a Black gay man of faith. Coming out to God, or rather letting God come into me. My story mirrors a familiar one to you. Maybe it's familiar to you, the struggle, the internalized rejection, the anguish, the agony of accepting the reality of who we are, and finally the joy. Except mine was compounded as I had to face and contend with a dual estrangement. Coming out as gay in a world where Catholic meant straight, and coming out as gay in a world where lesbian and gay meant white. So how is this story relevant to dignity? And especially today, how is it relevant to the challenge of white nationalism? What does white nationalism, have to do with us, you may say? I guess that depends upon who's included in us, but I'll come back to that. For now, I want to put forward this thesis. My basic message today is this: the greatest threat to the LGBTQ community in our entirety and in our diversity, the greatest threat we face is the rise of white nationalism in U.S. society. The rise of white nationalism. As I say on the screen, white nationalism is the existential, visceral conviction that this country, its public spaces, its history, its culture, that these belong to white people in a way that they do not and should not belong to others. That America is and was meant to be and should always remain a white Christian nation where white Christians belong in a privileged way. As a consequence, white nationalism sees multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy as an existential threat. It's an existential threat to white supremacy, to the feeling that the country belongs to us. Again, notice that word us. Who belongs, who's included in us? Because of white nationalism, the results of the 2020 election, with the election of the first president who ever used the phrase white supremacy, the election of the first woman and woman of color as the vice president, with the first Jewish spouse of a president or vice president in this nation's history, and the elections of the first Black and the first Jew as U.S. senators from Georgia. This election was an existential threat to white nationalist hopes and dreams, and a confirmation of its deepest fears that the country really was not one for people like us. And that meant that this election had to be overturned by any means necessary, including allegations of fraud, armed rebellion, and violent insurrection. The brutal mob violence of January 6th was a clear declaration. January 6th, it was just this year. Okay, so much has happened this year. This is not ancient history. The brutal mob violence of January 6th was a clear declaration that many white Americans would rather live in a white dictatorship than in a multiracial democracy. If democracy means sharing power with people of color, and especially with Black people, they want no part of it. White nationalism, white supremacy is inherently violent. It depends upon violence and the threat of violence, police violence, rhetorical violence, mob violence, and lynch violence to create it and sustain it. Now, some of you may be saying, okay, Father Brian, or Brian's my given name. Okay, I can see how this concerns you, but I still don't get what this has to do with us. Let me break it down for you. White nationalism is a threat to the well-being of all LGBTQ persons precisely because it is intersectional, threatening social stability and human flourishing on multiple levels and fronts. Its commitment to racist political and cultural supremacy is obvious, manifested in voter suppression laws, crusades against critical race theory, which most of its opponents have never read, I assure you, and its public vitriol. But make no mistake, white nationalism is also anti-women, as evidenced in the toxic masculinity and macho posturing of its former presidential standard bearer. Remember, grab them by their private parts. The overwhelmingly male violence of January 6th, and the public vilifications of both Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Representative Liz Cheney. Indeed, the denunciation of any woman who refuses the directives of male leadership. White nationalism is also anti-immigrant and anti-life, with its cruel family separations, inhumane caging of children, and callous indifference to brown bodies seeking shelter and safety. White nationalism is also anti-LGBTQ, as evidenced in its homophobic rhetoric and its hysteria surrounding the smallest attempts to recognize the dignity of trans persons. Let us not forget it was the champions of white nationalism who denigrated trans soldiers in the military, who championed anti-trans bathroom policies, who did not recognize therapies that facilitated physical transitions as legitimate medical expenses, who appointed judges hostile to recognizing the equality of gay and lesbian-headed families, and who championed churches in their crusade to weaponize gender ideology against those who would advocate for policies to protect gay and lesbian students in schools. That's why it's important to us. And also, white nationalism is an ecological threat to the survival of the planet with its obstinate refusal to accept the irrefutable reality of climate change, and it's a threat to global health and security through its irresponsible and reckless denigration of mask wearing and vaccination in the face of the greatest health crisis to afflict humanity in over a century. Make no mistake, if you were to map the advocates of white nationalism, those who are hostile to LGBTQ equality, the opponents of gender justice and inclusion onto a map, you would see an almost perfect overlap. This diagram you see on your screen here is very misleading. I struggled and played around with this. I tried to show how if you put them all together, it's almost a perfect overlap. But if I did that, then you wouldn't be able to read the screen. Basically, if you are a white nationalist, you are also anti-LGBTQ, you are also a misogynist. All of them go perfectly together. If you are racist, the chances that you are a misogynist, homophobic, trans, hostile, and anti-immigrant increase dramatically. To put it another way that Catholics can understand, white nationalism, patriarchy, and sexual rigidity are a virtually seamless garment. White nationalism is a consistent ethic of intolerance and hatred. So I don't exaggerate. White nationalism is a grave threat, not only to democracy, not only to darker-skinned people like me, it's a threat to the entire LGBTQ community. It is nakedly racist, blatantly homophobic, violently sexist, environmentally irresponsible, and recklessly narcissistic. As you gather this weekend to consider your journey forward, if you plot that journey forward and do not name white nationalism as the grave danger that it is to LGBTQ persons, that journey you plot will be a short one and one of great peril and danger. This leads me to considering the challenge that white nationalism raises for Dignity USA. In my title, of this talk, I quote the words of Exodus. I have heard the cries of my people, and I have come to deliver them. The Exodus story reminds us of how salvation history, the story of God's intervention into human life and history, how it begins with a listening to the cries, the moans, the groans of an oppressed people. For groans, the inarticulate cries of a people's distress. These groans are an indisputable sign which announces all is not well. Something is terribly wrong. This is not the way things should be. God intervenes graciously as liberator, as deliverer, as comforter. God intervenes because God first listened. And this leads to the major and principal challenge that I put before dignity as it strives for full justice and radical inclusion in the face of the virulence of white nationalism. Whose groans, whose cries are being heard? Whose voices are welcomed and attended to? Or to put it more bluntly, the challenge is, who counts as part of the Catholic sexually marginalized community? Who counts? Let me be forthright and direct. If Dignity USA is to be credible and on the frontier as a witness to radical sexual and gender inclusion, then it must become more and more consciously intersectional in its thinking, identity, and practices. Gender and sexual justice can no longer be standalone issues. The crisis that faces the nation and the world, the crises of health, ecology, racism, patriarchy, poverty, all of these are interlocking, overlapping, and compounded. Single issue groups and struggles will be neither effective nor will they compel people's attention and support. To paraphrase the great Black lesbian activist Audre Lorde, many people do not have the luxury of single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. Now, yes, Dignity USA enters the struggle for full justice and radical inclusion animated by a particular vision. On your vision statement, again, your website's beautiful, by the way. Your vision statement on your website declares that Dignity works for the day when gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Catholics are affirmed, respected, and full participants in the life of both church and society. That's wonderful. That's beautiful. I can say amen full-throatedly to that vision. But radical inclusion for gender and sexually stigmatized Catholics is impossible without a commitment to racial justice. Why? Because the opponents of sexual inclusion and racial justice are often one and the same. Remember the overlap that's there. Racial radical inclusion and full justice also requires sexual justice because many Catholic LGBTQI members are also racially and ethnically stigmatized. We live in this world where we have to contend with being rejected because we're not straight and we're not white. But there's an even greater reason why, if this vision is to be actualized, it requires a full-throated commitment to racial justice. And that is because the Catholic community both globally and nationally, is browning. And the future of dignity and the global LGBTQ movement is brown. As you see on the screen, even now, 70% of global Catholics live in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. 70%. The majority of U.S. Catholics are non-Anglos. That was something that was declared at a conference on cultural diversity in the church in 2010, where the Apostolic Nuncio declared that we do not have diversity in the church, we are a diverse church. And if you look at the graph on the right from our friends at the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at CARA, you notice the blue bar indicates the proportion of people in a cohort of Catholics who are white or Caucasian. When you look at the oldest group, those born the night before 1943, over 76% are white or Caucasian. But as the church gets younger, its complexion gets browner. So that by the time you get to Catholics born in 1982 or after, only 39%, less than 40%, are white. As the church gets younger, its face gets browner. Therefore, dignity's future, as the future of the Catholic Church and of every Catholic organization, is brown. This means that if dignity is unable or unwilling to hear the voices, the moans, the groans of Catholics of color, of LGBTQ Catholics of color, if it's unwilling to be a proactive ally in the struggle against white nationalism, there is no journey forward. There is no journey forward. And so the question becomes, what does dignity need to do now to prepare for its future? A future which is now. Now, I know that many of you, in fact, probably most of you, agree with everything I've said in principle. In principle. But let's also be honest. I'm going to make a bet that the overwhelming complexion of dignity members is rather pigmentationally challenged. Notice how I said that. Pigmentationally challenged. And like the larger LGBTQ movement, gay white men, especially, not only, but especially, have struggled to listen to and fully honor the perspectives of lesbian women, trans persons, persons of color, lesbians of color, gay men of color, and Black and brown trans persons. This is a long-standing tension in the larger LGBTQ movement, a tension between those in our communities who want to fit into the dominant society and enjoy the privileges granted to white straight men. Assimilation, what we now call homonormativity, which is basically an acceptance of those gays, of those, homos, quote unquote, who can best approximate cisgendered white straight life. And the tension with those forces in the community that want to transform the mainstream, to implode it, if you will, and create a new space where all are welcomed and included. You last gathered together in person at your 50th anniversary conference in 2019. And at that conference, preceding that conference was the third assembly of the global network of Rainbow Catholics. Their assembly preceded your 50th anniversary convention. And I had the privilege of addressing that network. As I addressed that network and I shared my coming out story, that was the first time I ever publicly shared it, many of the delegates from Asia, from Africa, and Latin America, they came to me afterwards, some in tears, saying it was the first time they felt included in a Catholic LGBTQ space. Sadly, not everyone from Dignity echoed that sentiment. Some got it, and some wondered, what's it all about? That's the tension. That's the challenge. That's what needs to be named and contended with going forward. In the Gospels, two disciples approach Jesus and they want the places of honor when he comes into his kingdom. They want the positions of privilege, the positions of belonging. They want to be the normal ones. And Jesus looks at them and says, it cannot be that way with you. I think those words are addressed to us in the LGBTQ movement at this time. It cannot be that way with you to want to be just simply included in the mainstream, to be deemed normal. As people of faith, we participate in the larger LGBTQ movement from a faith perspective, a perspective that's animated by a commitment to the pursuit of biblical shalom. Shalom. It's a word that we translate as peace, but it means much more. Shalom is a vision of social wholeness. It's a state of well-being for all, where all have access to the goods of creation intended to meet the needs of all. Shalom is nothing less than God's intended vision for the world, a dream of God that resists our tendencies to division, hostility, fear, drivenness, and misery. Our scriptures insist that if there is to be well-being, it will not be just for isolated, insulated individuals. Rather, security and prosperity are granted to the whole community. Together, we stand before God's blessings, and together we receive the gift of life, if we receive it at all. Shalom comes only to the inclusive, embracing community that excludes no one. So all must be included in the pursuit of shalom, or none will enjoy it. The biblical vision that animates us as we participate in the larger struggle for LGBTQ justice and equality is that we are motivated by our faith's insistence that this vision of fullness, of social wholeness, of completeness, of health and safety, that it must be enjoyed by all. Or, in reality, none of us will enjoy it. White nationalism is a threat to all of us. None of us are safe, regardless of our pigmentation or our gender or our class. The vision that Dignity is called to is to bring to the larger LGBTQ justice movement and to the wider church a vision of full justice and radical inclusion, of biblical shalom for all, and especially for God's beloved and fabulous gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, and intersex people. I want to conclude on a note of hope and blessing and prayer. Being a gay man of color is not just about pain and trauma. There's that, but it's also an experience of joy. Joy was the ending note of my retreat experience almost 40 years ago. That joy set me on a path of weaving together the fragments of my life, the threads of my life into a fabulous quilt, a tapestry integrating race and sexuality and faith. And despite the struggles that Marianne alluded to, and they are real, my ongoing joy through it all is reclaiming the goodness of my Black gay body, self, culture, and faith. To see my Black gay self and body as beloved by God. And this brings me to my dream for dignity. My dream as you journey forward is this: that you become more and more a community of joy. A joy that is found in the struggle, not despite it. A joy that springs from knowing that your painful struggles against white nationalism and for radical inclusion are the birth pains of the reign of God. That you may be a community of joy, a joy that erupts in shouts of fiesta and moves to the beat of gospel songs. A joy that erupts in circles that explode in riotous dance as LGBTQ people of every race, language, and way of life sway, sashay, and slay together. Yes, RuPaul's Drag Race is one of my guilty pleasures. A joy that comes out of difficult moments of honest encounter and truthful speech that sometimes hurt, but often heal. My dream, my hope for dignity as you journey forward is that you will be the joyful vanguard of what the whole church must one day become. A church where my coming out story is affirmed and celebrated. A church where the erotic and passionate loves of all of God's people are blessed. That you will be the joyful vanguard of a church where all are truly welcome at the table. That is my prayer for you. That is my hope for you. Those are the words of blessing with which I leave you. Let the church say, Amen.